What happens when the person sworn to protect you becomes the person you need protection from? What if the badge on their chest did not make them safer, but gave them the perfect cover? How many warning signs can a department ignore before one of its own becomes the crime? And when the people enforcing the law become killers, who is left to hold them accountable? Tonight, we're going inside 5 of the darkest law enforcement betrayal cases in America. Craig Allen Payer, Antoinette Frank, Drew Peterson, David Stephen Middleton, and James Aaron Duckett. 5 officers, 5 badges. 5 cases that force one question: how long were they hiding in plain sight? Before we begin, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the final case is not just about murder. It is about a former cop, an 11-year-old girl, and an execution that reignited a fight over whether the system got the right man. Case 1. Craig Allen Payer. Imagine you're 20 years old, driving home after spending the evening with your boyfriend. It's late. The highway is quiet. You've driven this road before. You know the exits. You know the way home. Then, flashing lights appear behind you. A California Highway Patrol officer wants you to pull over. So you do, because that's what you're taught to do. This is the story of Cara Evelyn Knott, a bright, kind-hearted college student whose life ended on a cold December night in 1986. And the man convicted of killing her was not a stranger waiting in the dark. He was the officer who pulled her over. Cara Knott was 20 years old. She was studying child development at San Diego State University and hoped to become a teacher. Her family remembered her as warm, funny, and full of life, the type of young woman who made people feel better just by being in the room. On December 27, 1986, Cara spent the evening at her boyfriend's home in Escondido, California. Around 9:30 p.m., she said goodbye, got into her car, and began the normal drive back to her parents' home in El Cajon. She was supposed to take Interstate 15 south, a route she had driven countless times. But the next morning, Cara's car was found abandoned near the Mercy Road exit, an isolated, unfinished off-ramp along I-15. Her car had been pulled over awkwardly, as if she had stopped in a hurry. Then investigators looked below the bridge. At the bottom of a 65-foot ravine, hidden among the brush, they found Cara's body. She had been beaten. She had been strangled. And somewhere between that familiar drive home and that dark ravine, Cara had crossed paths with a man who carried a badge, a gun, and the power to make a young woman obey without asking questions. His name was Craig Allen Payer. At the time, Payer was a 36-year-old California Highway Patrol officer with 13 years on the job. On paper, he was exactly the kind of officer the public trusted. Clean-cut, polite, experienced, a man who knew the roads, knew the law, and knew how to make people feel safe. But behind the uniform, another story had been quietly building. For years, women had described strange encounters with Payer. Young women, women driving alone, women stopped late at night for vague reasons, sometimes for no reason at all. They said he lingered too long, asked personal questions, commented on their looks, touched their hair, brushed against their shoulders. Some said he flirted. Others said he made them feel trapped, isolated, and afraid. But complaints about an experienced officer are not always treated like warnings. Sometimes they are treated like misunderstandings. And by the time Cara Knott met Craig Payer on that dark stretch of Interstate 15, those warnings meant nothing. Cara was not on a dangerous street. She was not meeting a stranger. She was driving home. And if an officer told her to pull over, she had been taught to do exactly that. If the badge makes you obey, what happens when the person wearing it is the danger? The case against Payer began to take shape almost immediately. 2 days after Cara was killed, Payer appeared on local television for a segment about women's safety on the highway. Think about that. A police officer whose job was to reassure women that the roads were safe appeared on television just days after a young woman had been murdered on his patrol route. He smiled for the cameras. He gave advice about driving alone at night. He spoke like the protector he wanted the public to believe he was. But viewers noticed something strange. Fresh scratches across his face. Raw marks that did not look minor. Marks Payer tried to explain away by claiming he had fallen against a fence at the CHP station. Investigators checked the story. The fence did not match the injuries. And what they believed those scratches really showed was something far more disturbing. Kara had fought back. She had scratched the man who attacked her. And the marks were now sitting on Payer's face for the whole city to see. As detectives dug deeper, the evidence began to pile up. A rope was found in Payer's patrol car. Experts compared it with the marks on Kara's neck. The patterns were consistent. Investigators found fibers on Kara's clothing that prosecutors said matched fibers from Payer's CHP uniform and gun belt. They also found a distinctive gold rayon fiber on her clothing that was linked to the shoulder patch of his patrol jacket. There was also blood evidence. A blood spot found on Kara's boot was consistent with Payer's rare AB-negative blood type, according to testimony presented by prosecutors. His logbook raised more questions. The timeline appeared altered. His movements did not line up cleanly with what investigators believed had happened that night. Piece by piece, prosecutors built a horrifying picture. They argued that Payer stopped Kara while on duty, used the power of his uniform to control her, and when she resisted, he attacked her. They said he beat her, strangled her, and threw her body into the ravine below Mercy Road. But proving it in court would not be easy. Payer's first trial began in 1988. Kara's family sat through testimony about the last terrifying hours of her life. They heard about the rope, the scratches, the fibers, the blood, the complaints from other young women, and they waited for justice. Then the jury came back divided. 7 jurors wanted to convict. 5 wanted to acquit. Hung jury. For Kara's family, it was devastating. A young woman had been murdered. A highway patrol officer had been tied to the case by physical evidence. But still, there was no verdict. Still, there was no closure. What happens when the people trained to protect lives become the ones accused of taking them? A judge said the California Highway Patrol bureaucracy deserved at least part of the blame for what happened to Kara. If Kara's story has already shaken you, hit the like button, because the next case proves the warning signs were not always hidden. Sometimes they were reported, documented, and ignored. Craig Payer was never sentenced to death. He remains incarcerated, having been denied parole in 2004, 2008, and 2012. He has continued to maintain his innocence, and his next parole eligibility is scheduled for January 2027. But for Kara's family, the sentence does not erase the central betrayal. The officer who was supposed to make the roads safer became the reason their daughter never came home. Payer's badge gave him access to women alone on the road. But the next officer used something even more dangerous: the trust of a family who believed she was one of them. Case 2. Antoinette Frank. A police officer walks into a restaurant late at night. She knows the owners. She knows the staff. She has worked security there before. She has a key. To the people inside, she is not a threat. She is the police. But before the night is over, a fellow officer will be dead. 2 young restaurant workers will be executed. And the woman wearing the badge will allegedly return to the crime scene, in uniform, pretending she has come to help. This is the story of Antoinette Frank, a former New Orleans police officer who became one of the most controversial women ever sentenced to death in the United States. When Antoinette Frank joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993, the city was desperate for officers. New Orleans was dealing with violent crime, low morale, police corruption, and an understaffed department struggling to recruit. The NOPD needed new people in uniform, and Frank looked like she could be part of the solution. She was young, driven, a woman entering a department where women of color were still underrepresented. On the surface, her hiring seemed like progress. But beneath that surface were warnings. Serious ones. Frank had been fired from a previous job and did not disclose it properly on her application. She performed poorly on psychological screening. A pre-employment report found concerns involving impulse control, maturity, adjustment, and authority. The department psychiatrist, Dr. Philip Scuria, examined her and concluded that she was not suitable to become a police officer. He did not describe a woman with a major psychiatric illness. He described someone with personality traits that made her unacceptable for the job. But Frank sought another opinion. A second evaluator acknowledged several of the same concerns but gave greater weight to her recommendation letters and did not believe the traits should prevent her from being hired. And on February 7, 1993, Antoinette Frank became a New Orleans police officer. From the beginning, colleagues found her unusual. She was quiet, detached, socially awkward. Some officers later said she struggled with the basics of policing. Supervisors reportedly considered additional training and oversight, but no one saw what was coming. Or maybe they saw pieces of it and decided not to look too closely. If the NOPD had stopped at the first warning, the story might have ended there. But it didn't. In late 1994, Frank responded to a shooting involving an 18-year-old man named Rogers Lacaze. Lacaze was known to police. He had a reputation as a drug dealer. He was not the kind of person an officer was supposed to befriend, protect, or bring close to the job. But Frank did. At first, she told people she was trying to help him, trying to turn his life around. But soon, Lacaze was reportedly riding in her personal car. Then he was seen inside her police car. Frank gave different explanations. He was a trainee. He was her nephew. He was helping her. But people around them believed something much darker was happening. Frank and Lacaze had become involved. A police officer and a young man tied to crime. A relationship that should have set off alarms inside any department. Then came February 1995. According to testimony and later reporting, Frank and Lacaze were involved in a confrontation with two men after a party. Lacaze reportedly displayed a Tech-9 firearm. A civil sheriff came upon the scene and saw Frank in uniform while Lacaze held the weapon. Instead of treating Lacaze as the danger, Frank defended him. "Lacaze is the good guy," she reportedly said. Let that sink in. A police officer was standing beside an armed man during a confrontation and told another law enforcement official that he was the good guy. No major investigation followed. No meaningful discipline. No intervention that stopped the relationship. And less than a month later, 3 people would be dead. The place was called Kim An, a family-owned Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans East. Frank knew it well. She and her police partner, Officer Ronald Ronnie Williams II, sometimes worked paid security details there. The Vu family knew Frank. They had allowed her into their lives. She had access to the restaurant. She had earned their trust. Or so they believed. The Vu family knew Frank. They trusted her. She worked security there. She had a key. In their minds, she was not the danger walking through the door. She was the police. Just after midnight, on March 4, 1995, Kim An had closed for the night. Employees were cleaning. The restaurant was quiet. Frank had reportedly stopped by earlier with Lacaze for food. Then she returned. At some point, Frank and Lacaze forced people into the kitchen area. Officer Williams, Frank's own police partner, was working security that night. He had no reason to believe that the woman beside him, another officer, someone wearing the same badge, could be part of the danger. But prosecutors said Lacaze emerged and shot Williams in the neck. Williams fell. Then he was shot again, and again. He was killed at point-blank range. A New Orleans police officer murdered not by a criminal he had chased down in the streets, but during a robbery allegedly carried out by the person he worked beside. Then, the violence turned toward the Vu family. Ha Vu was 24 years old. Her brother, Quang Vu, was 17. They were not criminals. They were not targets in a gang war. They were young people working in their family's restaurant. According to prosecutors, Frank and Lacaze demanded to know where the money was. When they did not get the answer they wanted, Ha and Chuang were shot and killed. But two people survived. Chow Vu and Quoc Vu hid in the restaurant's cooler, listening in the dark while their brother, sister, and the officer who was supposed to protect them were murdered. Imagine that. You are trapped in a freezer. You cannot turn on a light. You cannot make a sound. You can only listen. And outside that door is a woman your family trusted, a police officer, allegedly helping destroy everything you know. Chow and Quoc eventually escaped and got help. But the nightmare was not over. Because when the emergency call came over police radio, officer down at Kim An, Frank allegedly did something that should make every person watching this question how much power a uniform can give someone. She came back. She did not run. She did not disappear. She returned in a police vehicle, wearing her uniform, armed, and pretending to respond to the crime like any other officer. Prosecutors argued that she came back to eliminate the surviving witnesses, but Chow saw her, and when Frank appeared, Chow ran toward arriving officers and identified her. The mask was gone. Antoinette Frank was arrested. Rogers Lacaze was arrested later, and suddenly, the city of New Orleans had to confront the unthinkable. A rookie police officer had not merely failed to stop a crime, she had been accused of helping orchestrate one. When an officer knows every crime scene procedure, every witness risk, every way an investigation works, does that make justice easier, or does it make the crime harder to prove? The evidence in the case was overwhelming. Survivors testified. Physical evidence linked the defendants to the restaurant, and the detail that haunted the courtroom was what happened afterward. Lacaze used Officer Williams's credit card shortly after the killings. Lacaze was tried first. A jury convicted him of the murders of Officer Williams, Ha Vu, and Quang Vu. He originally received a death sentence, though he was later resentenced to life without parole. Then it was Frank's turn. Her trial moved with stunning speed. The jury took just 22 minutes to find her guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Then, after the penalty phase, it took roughly 35 to 45 minutes to recommend death. On October 20th, 1995, Antoinette Frank was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection. But this is where the controversy begins. Not over whether 3 people died, not over the horror of what happened inside Kim An, but over whether Antoinette Frank's life history, legal representation, and mental health evidence were properly weighed before the state decided she should die. Frank has alleged that she suffered abuse and trauma during childhood, including allegations involving her father. Her lawyers have argued that trauma, psychological damage, and ineffective mitigation during her trial should matter when deciding whether she deserves execution. Critics reject that argument. They point to the planning, the relationship with Lacaze, the return to Kim An, the attempt to blend back into the scene as a responding officer. They ask how childhood trauma can possibly explain the execution-style killing of a fellow officer and 2 young workers. And that is the uncomfortable divide at the center of the case. Can a person be deeply damaged and still fully responsible? Can trauma explain a crime without excusing it? And when the crime is this brutal, should anything reduce the punishment? If you think a badge should never give anyone a free pass, subscribe now, because the next man did not just benefit from the system's trust, he built an entire life around it. Frank's clemency request was rejected by Louisiana's Pardon Board in 2023, but her legal process is not over. In 2026, she returned to court as she continued challenging her death sentence through post-conviction filings. The central dispute includes whether the long delay in litigation has prejudiced the state's ability to respond to her claims. So, despite the death sentence, Antoinette Frank does not have a confirmed active execution date. She remains on Louisiana's death row. For the Vu family, for the family of Officer Ronald Williams II, and for the survivors who heard the killings from inside that cooler, the legal debate does not change what happened. 3 people went to work that night. None of them came home. Frank was supposed to protect a partner. Instead, prosecutors proved she helped execute him. The next officer's victims were not co-workers. They were the women closest to him. And one of them was never found. In every case so far, somebody saw something first. A complaint, a warning, a behavior that did not fit. But a badge has a way of making people doubt their own instincts. Keep watching, because the next case is about a cop who may have turned that doubt into a weapon for decades. Case 3. Drew Peterson. He was the charming face of law enforcement in Bolingbrook, Illinois. A decorated police sergeant, a husband, a father, a man who knew how to smile for a camera, shake a hand, and make people believe he was in control. But behind the badge was a different kind of story. A trail of broken marriages. Women who said they were afraid of him. One wife found dead in a bathtub. Another wife who vanished without a trace. And a former police officer who seemed to believe he could talk his way out of anything. This is the story of Drew Peterson. At first glance, Drew Peterson had everything. Born in 1954, he grew up in the Chicago area, joined the Army after high school, and later entered law enforcement. In 1977, he joined the Bolingbrook Police Department. 2 years later, he was named Police Officer of the Year. He had the uniform, the authority, the reputation. To people in town, he was not just another officer. He was the kind of man people expected to see in a parade, at a school event, or answering a call when something went wrong. But charm can be a mask. And over time, the story behind Drew Peterson's marriages began to show a pattern that was much darker than the public image. His first wife was Carol Brown, his high school sweetheart. They married in 1974 and had 2 sons, but the marriage collapsed after Carol learned Drew had been unfaithful. Then came Vicki Connolly. They married in 1982. To the outside world, it looked like a fresh start. But Vicki later said the relationship was full of intimidation, threats, and fear. She claimed Drew told her he could kill her and make it look like an accident. Think about that. A police officer telling his own wife that he could make her death look accidental. At the time, it was a claim buried inside another troubled marriage. No murder charge, no national headlines, just another woman saying she was afraid. Then came Kathleen Savio. Kathleen was smart, independent, strong-willed. She worked as an accountant. She married Drew in 1992, and they had 2 sons together, Thomas and Christopher. But the marriage became volatile. Police were called to their home again and again. Reports described domestic disputes, arguments over visitation, screaming matches, a house where the tension had become normal. By 2003, Kathleen and Drew were divorced. And then, just months later, Kathleen was dead. On March 1, 2004, Kathleen Savio was found in the bathtub of her home. The official ruling, at first, was accidental drowning. But the scene disturbed people who saw it. The bathtub was dry. Kathleen's hair was wet with blood. There was a deep gash on the back of her head, bruising on her body, marks that did not look like a simple fall in a bathroom. Later court records described injuries that led a second pathologist to conclude she had been killed before being placed in the tub. Still, in 2004, the case was closed. Accident. No murder investigation. No arrest. And Drew Peterson walked away. But Kathleen had told people she was afraid. She had reportedly told friends and relatives that Drew had threatened her, that he had the power to make something happen and make it look like an accident. And nobody acted fast enough. How many times can a woman say she is afraid before the system decides fear is evidence? For 3 years, Kathleen's death remained an unanswered question. Then, in October 2007, Drew Peterson's fourth wife disappeared. Her name was Stacey Ann Peterson. She was 23 years old. Drew was 49 when he married her. She had children. She was studying nursing. She had a life in front of her. But according to people close to her, Stacey had begun to see a side of Drew that the public rarely saw. She was afraid. Stacey was 23 years old. She had children. She had plans. And she was reportedly starting to say out loud what frightened people most: that Drew had killed Kathleen, and that she was afraid she would be next. Stacey told people she was considering leaving him. She spoke to her pastor, Reverend Neil Shorey. She reportedly said that Drew had confessed to killing Kathleen Savio and making it look like an accident. She spoke to family members. She reportedly told her sister, Cassandra Cales, about a large blue barrel in Drew's home, a barrel that would later become one of the most chilling images connected to the case. Then, on October 28, 2007, Stacey vanished. No goodbye note. No confirmed trip. No phone call to tell her children where she was going. No body. Drew claimed Stacey had left him for another man, but her family did not believe it. Her friends did not believe it. And investigators did not believe it. Stacey's disappearance forced authorities to look back at Kathleen Savio's death. Her body was exhumed. This time, the medical conclusion was different. Kathleen had not accidentally drowned. She had been murdered, and suddenly, Drew Peterson was no longer just a grieving ex-husband with a troubled past. He was the prime suspect in a homicide. The investigation into Stacey's disappearance became more disturbing with every new account. What happens when the people trained to protect lives become the ones accused of taking them? A friend, Rick Mims, reportedly said he and Drew had bought large blue barrels years earlier. And while no body was found, while no forensic evidence gave police the final proof they needed to charge him in Stacey's disappearance, the public watched the story turn into something almost unreal. Drew Peterson appeared on television. He gave interviews. He joked. He smiled. He flirted with reporters. At one point, he even participated in a media-driven dating spectacle while his missing wife's family was begging the public for answers. To some people, it looked like arrogance. To others, it looked like a man who knew exactly how to manipulate attention. He had been a police officer for decades. He understood investigations. He understood how witnesses worked. He understood public pressure. And he seemed to believe he could control the story the same way he had allegedly controlled the women around him. But Kathleen's case finally went to trial in 2012. The prosecution's case was unusual and controversial because Kathleen was dead and Stacey was missing. Much of the evidence involved things the women had told others while they were alive, statements about fear, threats, and what they believed Drew had done. The court allowed some of those statements under the legal doctrine known as forfeiture by wrongdoing, The idea that a defendant should not benefit from a witness's absence if the defendant caused that absence. On September 6, 2012, a jury found Drew Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in Kathleen Savio's death. He was later sentenced to 38 years in prison. But even behind bars, Drew Peterson did not stop trying to control the people around him. In 2016, prosecutors said Peterson tried to arrange the murder of James Glasgow, the Will County State's attorney who had helped convict him in Kathleen's case. The alleged plan involved other inmates, cash, and a man Peterson thought he could trust. He was wrong. A jury convicted Peterson of solicitation of murder and solicitation of murder for hire. He received another 40 years in prison, to be served after his sentence for Kathleen's murder. If you are still watching, make sure you subscribe. The next case shows what happens when a former officer loses his badge, but finds an even easier way to get inside a victim's home. Today, Drew Peterson remains incarcerated. He is not on death row. But for the Peterson family, prison does not answer the question that matters most. Where is Stacy? No one has ever been charged in her disappearance. Her body has never been found. And Drew Peterson remains the prime suspect in a case that has stayed open for nearly 2 decades. That is the haunting part of this story. Kathleen got a trial. Kathleen got a verdict. But Stacy got silence. And sometimes, silence can be more terrifying than any confession. Drew Peterson allegedly used charm, fear, and his knowledge of the system to control the women around him. David Middleton had a different method. He changed uniforms, changed states, and turned access itself into a weapon. Case 4. David Stephen Middleton. What if the man installing your cable box once carried a badge? What if the person knocking at your door, smiling with a clipboard in one hand and a toolbox in the other, had already learned how to use authority to make women obey? And what if the trusted officer who promised to protect people had become a predator hiding behind whatever uniform gave him the easiest access? This is the story of David Stephen Middleton, former police officer, cable technician, convicted murderer, and a man investigators have linked to more women than the courts were ever able to fully account for. David Stephen Middleton was born in Boston in 1961. He grew up around law enforcement. His father was a police officer. Authority was familiar to him. Uniforms were familiar to him. The idea that people were supposed to listen when you spoke with confidence, that was familiar too. By the early 1980s, Middleton had moved to Florida and joined the Miami-Dade Police Department. He looked the part, clean-cut, confident. A young officer with a badge on his chest and the power to stop people, question people, and tell them where to go. But prosecutors and survivors later described a darker reality. They said Middleton did not see the badge as a responsibility. He saw it as access. He allegedly used traffic stops and curfew laws to isolate young women. He would find girls walking alone, pull up in his vehicle, and claim they were breaking a rule. He would tell them they needed to come with him. And when a police officer tells a teenager to get in the car, what are they supposed to do? One of those victims was a 16-year-old girl, known publicly only as AC. In 1990, Middleton stopped her in Miami and told her she was out past curfew. He reportedly claimed that her parents were worried and that he would take her somewhere safe. Instead, prosecutors said he drove her to a remote area. He handcuffed her, and he raped her. Afterward, AC said he dropped her off and threatened her with the words every victim fears most: "No one will believe you." But AC did something Middleton may not have expected. She told people. She reported him. And Middleton was arrested and faced charges connected to the attack, but the rape charge ended without a jury agreement. He was convicted on lesser charges of false imprisonment and aggravated assault, and received a 5-year sentence. 5 years. For a teenage girl who said a police officer used the authority of his badge to isolate, restrain, and rape her, he served only part of that sentence. Then he was released, and the system gave him a second chance. Not because his victim had been wrong, not because the warning signs had disappeared, but because the legal system had not convicted him of the most serious charge. So Middleton moved, first to Colorado, then eventually to Nevada. And this time, he did not need a police uniform. He found something quieter, something that gave him just as much access. He became a cable technician. Think about what that job gives someone. A reason to knock on a stranger's door, a reason to enter a home, a reason to see who lives alone, a reason to notice bedrooms, locks, routines, schedules, and the quiet places where nobody would hear you scream. No badge, no patrol car, no gun belt. Just a uniform with a company logo, a truck outside, and a reason for people to let him in. The first woman connected to Middleton's name in Colorado was Buffy Rice Donahue. Buffy was 18 years old. In November 1993, she left her parents' home in Montrose, Colorado, saying she was going to wash her car and get something to drink. She never came back. Her car was found near a Walmart. Her wallet was inside. Her driver's license was inside, but Buffy was gone. For years, her family had no answer, no trial, no conviction, no one in court forced to explain what happened to their daughter. Middleton later became a prime suspect in Buffy's disappearance and death, but he was never charged in her case. One account from his former girlfriend, Yvonne Haley, alleged that Middleton left with Buffy and later returned saying he had accidentally killed her. Middleton has not been prosecuted for Buffy's death. And that distinction matters, because suspicion is not a conviction. A connection is not a verdict. But for a family waiting decades for an answer, that legal difference can become its own kind of torture. Buffy Donahue's family did not get a trial. They did not get a verdict. They did not get a body. For them, suspected is not closure. It is a word they have been forced to live inside for decades. Then came Nevada. On August 8, 1994, Thelma Amparo Davila disappeared from the apartment she shared with her sister in Sparks, Nevada. Thelma was 42 years old, a Guatemalan immigrant, a hard-working employee at Circus Circus, a woman who had built a life far from home and was expected to return after work. But she vanished. Months later, her body was found near Verdi, Nevada. She had been bound and wrapped in plastic. The exact cause of death could not be determined because of decomposition, but investigators believed she had been kidnapped and murdered. Then, just 6 months later, another woman disappeared. Catherine Powell was 45 years old, a school teacher at Sun Valley Elementary School in Reno. She was known as kind, generous, the kind of person who trusted people. The kind of person who might open the door to someone who looked professional and said he was there to provide a service. On February 6, 1995, Catherine vanished from her home. Her truck was outside. Her belongings were inside. But Catherine was gone. 5 days later, her body was found inside a trash bin near Virginia Lake. She had been bound, wrapped in a sleeping bag and trash bags, and prosecutors presented evidence that she had suffered before she died. This is where investigators began looking closely at the cable service records. David Middleton had performed a cable installation at Catherine Powell's home shortly before she disappeared. He had access. He knew where she lived. He knew the layout, and witnesses had described a vehicle near her home that resembled the truck Middleton drove. Police searched Middleton's apartment and storage unit. What they found was disturbing. Catherine's credit card had been used after she disappeared. Investigators found evidence tied to property taken from her home. They found restraint devices. They found a modified refrigerator that prosecutors said was connected to Catherine's captivity. And they found physical evidence that helped turn suspicion into a capital murder case. The prosecution argued that Middleton abducted Catherine, held her captive in a storage unit, tortured her, and later disposed of her body. They also argued that Thelma Davila's murder showed the same pattern: a woman taken from her home, held against her will, killed, and discarded. But Middleton had an explanation. He admitted that he knew Catherine Powell. He admitted that he had been inside her home. He claimed they had consensual sex. Then he claimed he returned later and found her dead. He said he panicked. So, according to him, he wrapped her body and dumped her in a trash bin because nobody would believe his version of events. Let that sink in. His defense was not that he had never been there. It was that he had found a dead woman, hidden her body, used her credit card, and hoped nobody would ask questions. The jury did not believe him. In 1997, David Stephen Middleton was convicted of the murders of Catherine Powell and Thelma Davila, along with kidnapping and other related offenses. The jury sentenced him to death for both murders. But this is where the controversy returns. Because Middleton's case has never been simple. His lawyers have argued for years that the two homicide cases should not have been tried together, that the evidence involving Thelma Davila was unreliable, and that later information weakened parts of the state's case. His 2023 Supreme Court filing maintained that substantial evidence had emerged undermining the case connecting him to Davila's death. The Nevada Supreme Court, however, upheld the convictions and death sentence, rejecting arguments that the evidence was insufficient and that the cases should have been separated. So where does that leave the families? Catherine Powell's family has a conviction. Thelma Davila's family has a conviction. But Buffy Donahue's family still has a question mark. And that is the cruelty of suspected cases. A person can be on death row for 2 murders and still leave another family with no legal answer at all. When a predator has a badge, a uniform, and later a service job that puts him inside homes, how many chances does the system give him before it finally believes the victims? Drop a comment below. Should a former officer's history of abuse be allowed to show a pattern in court, even when each victim's case cannot be fully proven on its own? David Stephen Middleton remains on Nevada's death row. He has been there for decades. There is no confirmed execution date. For some people, that is proof the appeal system is doing what it is supposed to do. For others, it is another delay in a case where families have already waited long enough. Middleton's case leaves families waiting for an execution that may never come. But the final case is even more uncomfortable, because it asks whether an execution can be justice if the evidence itself is still being argued over decades later. Case 5. James Aaron Duckett. Imagine you are 11 years old. You have just left a convenience store after buying candy. You are walking home in a small Florida town where people still believe a police car means safety. Then an officer pulls up beside you. He asks where you are going. He tells you to get in. And you do. Because he is a cop. Because you have been taught that police officers protect children. But the next day, your body is found near a lake. This is the story of Teresa Mae Maccabee. And the former police officer convicted of raping and murdering her was James Aaron Duckett. It is also one of the most controversial death penalty cases in recent American history. Because in 2026, nearly 4 decades after Teresa was killed, the state of Florida executed Duckett. But the questions around the evidence, including disputed hair comparison testimony and DNA testing that produced no clear answer, did not disappear with him. May 11, 1987, Mascot, Florida. Teresa Maccabee was 11 years old. She was a child. A daughter. A girl who should have been worried about school, friends, and getting home before dark. That evening, Teresa went to a convenience store. A teenage boy was nearby, waiting for his uncle. Then a mascot police car pulled into the area. The officer behind the wheel was James Duckett. He was 29 years old and had been on the force for only months. Witnesses said Duckett asked questions. He spoke with Teresa. Nothing looked unusual at first. After all, he was in uniform. He was driving a marked patrol car. He was the kind of person adults told children to trust. The teenage boy later saw Teresa near Duckett's patrol car. Then he saw her get inside. The car drove away. It was the last time Teresa Maccabee was seen alive. The next day, a fisherman found her body near Night Lake. A family's worst nightmare had become real. The little girl who had walked into a store the night before had not come home, and the final person known to be with her was a police officer. Teresa was 11. She was not supposed to know how to fear the people sworn to protect her. Her family did not get nearly 40 years of legal arguments. They got an empty seat at every birthday, every Christmas. Every school year she never got to finish. Every ordinary day that followed. Investigators quickly focused on Duckett. They said witnesses placed him with Teresa. They said he was the only officer assigned to patrol that area at the time. They found Teresa's fingerprints and Duckett's fingerprints on the hood of his patrol car in a position prosecutors argued suggested she had been sitting or placed there. Tire tracks near the crime scene were also linked to Duckett's patrol vehicle. Then came the hair evidence. At Duckett's 1988 trial, FBI forensic examiner Michael Malone testified that a pubic hair found in Teresa's underwear was consistent with Duckett's hair. The prosecution treated it as a powerful part of a largely circumstantial case. But this is where the case became controversial. Hair comparison evidence is not DNA. It cannot identify one person with the certainty of a modern genetic profile. And over the years, forensic hair testimony, including testimony from FBI examiners in numerous older criminal cases, came under intense scrutiny for overstating what a visual comparison could actually prove. Duckett's attorneys argued that the hair evidence was never reliable enough to help send a man to death row. That does not prove Duckett was innocent. But it does mean one of the case's most dramatic pieces of evidence has been debated for decades. And there were more questions. The case against Duckett was circumstantial. No confession. No murder weapon. No eyewitness who saw Teresa being killed. The state had the patrol car, the prints, the tire tracks, the hair testimony, and the fact that Teresa was last seen getting into Duckett's vehicle. For prosecutors, that was enough. For Duckett's defense, it was not. In 1988, a jury found James Aaron Duckett guilty of first-degree murder and sexual battery. He was sentenced to death. But even then, investigators believed Teresa's murder might not have been the only one connected to him. A year before Teresa was killed, an unidentified woman was found strangled in Polk County. Witnesses had reportedly seen her enter a dark blue car before she disappeared, and Duckett owned a blue Buick Regal. Then, months after Teresa's murder, 14-year-old Jennifer Cheyenne Weldon vanished after leaving a carnival. Her body was later found in a rural part of Polk County. She had also been strangled. Investigators considered Duckett a suspect in both killings, but he was never charged, never convicted. And that distinction matters, because a suspicion is not a verdict. An alleged pattern is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But when the same name keeps surfacing around unsolved deaths, families are left wondering whether the system stopped a predator after one victim or missed the chance to stop him earlier. For decades, Duckett remained on Florida's death row. He appealed. His lawyers challenged the hair evidence. They challenged the reliability of witnesses. They argued the jury had been shown forensic conclusions that modern science would not express the same way. And as technology changed, the biggest question became obvious. Why not test the biological evidence for DNA? For years, that question followed the case. Then, in 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Duckett's death warrant. His execution was initially set for March 31, 2026. But days before he was scheduled to die, the Florida Supreme Court issued a rare stay to allow new DNA testing on biological material from Teresa's underwear. The results came back inconclusive. Not a match. Not an exclusion. Not proof of innocence. Not new proof of guilt. Just inconclusive. A later analysis reached the same bottom line. There was not enough usable data to reliably state whether Duckett was or was not a contributor to the DNA mixture. If the state executes a former officer after disputed forensic evidence and inconclusive DNA testing, does that close the case or make the questions permanent? Florida courts ultimately rejected Duckett's arguments. The Florida Supreme Court ruled that the inconclusive testing did not establish a legal basis to overturn his conviction or prevent the execution from going forward. In July 2026, the court lifted the stay. Duckett's attorneys made final attempts to obtain additional testing on clothing and fingernail scrapings from Teresa's case. They argued that further testing could provide answers that the first round did not. The state argued that decades of litigation had already been exhausted and that no court had found evidence clearing Duckett. And then came July 28, 2026. James Aaron Duckett was executed by lethal injection. For some people, it was justice finally delivered for Teresa Maccabee, an 11-year-old girl who trusted an officer and never came home. For others, it was the end of a case that still carried unresolved scientific questions. Share this video with someone who believes every death row case is simple, because this one proves that guilt, justice, evidence, and execution do not always sit comfortably in the same room. On July 28, 2026, James Aaron Duckett was executed by lethal injection. But the controversy did not die with him. For Teresa's family, nothing can undo the night their daughter disappeared. For those who question the evidence, an execution is irreversible. And when the state imposes the final punishment, inconclusive is not always a word that disappears. Sometimes it becomes the question that outlives everyone involved. 5 officers, 5 badges. 5 different paths into darkness. Craig Allen Payer, Antoinette Frank, Drew Peterson, David Stephen Middleton, James Aaron Duckett. One pulled over a young woman who believed she was safe. One walked into a restaurant where a family trusted her, then left 3 people dead. One used charm, fear, and his knowledge of the law to control the women closest to him. One traded a police badge for a cable uniform and allegedly turned access into a weapon. And one was executed after nearly 40 years of arguments over guilt, evidence, and whether the system had truly answered every question. Some are on death row. Some are serving life. One is dead. And one still waits for parole. But the most disturbing part of every case is not the uniform they wore. It is what that uniform allowed people to assume, that they were safe, that they were telling the truth, that they were the people to call when danger came. And every time that trust was misplaced, someone else paid for it. The victims, the families, the people who saw the warning signs and were never believed. Subscribe to Craziest Tuesday Crimes for more true crime stories the mainstream won't touch, and turn on notifications, because the next story may prove the most dangerous person in the room is sometimes the one wearing the badge.